You know very well who these people are. They're some of the most renowned statesmen and leaders of the modern period. But do you know who these guys are? They're the people that defeated some of the most renowned statesmen and leaders of the modern period. Yet nobody knows their story. Back in the day, conquest, the act of attaining power, was synonymous with military operation. To this very day, many still think it is this way. But these people are wrong. The modern conqueror isn't a public figure. He doesn't lead men into battle. He doesn't even have an army, nor does he pay much attention to fame and glory. He is a financier. He dabbles in the most refined, concentrated form of power, the power over money, that the whole world, ever since the inception of currency, has been revolving around. He finds secrecy, manipulation, and raw efficiency to be virtues, as only they will be able to elevate him to a position so powerful that people who don't even acknowledge his existence feel the effects of his rule every day. But how do you do it as a financier? How do you rise to power? Well, however, the golden age of fiscal expansionism is long behind us, just like Rome saw the greatest expansion in the times of the Republic and only sought to consolidate during the Principate. The same way nowadays, we're only seeing financial consolidation. The central banks are all already there, set in stone. But as I've said, there was a time when banking was a shortcut that elevated unremarkable men into masters, and this is a story of how they did it and the strategies they used, dissected in analysis. Here are some hypothetical examples of how to take over a government if you're a banker, based on historical examples that might or might not be true, because of course when you venture into such a topic like central banking, truth is very often obscured and hidden under layers of omissions and conspiracies. So the first step in conquest is of course setting the stage, and most importantly, finding a victim. To set the stage for this case study, let's go back to the 18th century, the times before total banking domination, the era where central banking was still in its infancy. If you want to know anything about deception and subterfuge, look no further than the Bank of England, the historical archetype of a cunning and deceptive institution, the institution that through its descendants managed to conquer the whole world. To the aspiring financier, the Bank of England is who Alexander the Great was to Napoleon. I've covered the history of the Bank of England in part 1, but the long story short is that it was established by a cabal of financiers who, through all means necessary, ranging from political violence, instilling division, bribery, market manipulation, military invasions, and pamphleteering, managed to secure their position as the most influential financial institution at the time, and one of the most powerful political entities, being the de facto rulers in most of Europe by the 19th century. But there was one place of paramount importance that they have forgone to subjugate yet: the colonial states of America, an English colony that above all valued independence. The colonial period in America was marked by unmatched prosperity. There were almost no taxes, no central bank that stood above the state governments, allowing them to use tax revenues for productive purposes. Ben Franklin wrote that it's impossible to find a happier and more prosperous population on all the surface of the globe. Compared to England, the colonies had lower tax rates that didn't go towards paying a perpetually increasing debt, higher employment, fewer recessions, and an average income that was higher by 30 to 60% than in England. For a banker, such prosperity is a sign that a country has too much capital not being wasted on a never-ending debt. Every penny that doesn't go into the banker's pocket through debt is a penny wasted to him, even if the side product is prosperity. It was only a matter of time before the Bank of England caught onto this power vacuum. The Bank of England didn't really acknowledge this glaring difference in living conditions until Benjamin Franklin paid a visit to London in 1763. He remarked how, compared to the slum conditions in England, the colonies were miles ahead in the living standard. When asked by the Parliament about what the colonies do differently to warrant such prosperity, he said, "That is simple. In the colonies, we issue our own money. It's called colonial scrip. We issue it in proper proportion to make the products pass easily from the producers to consumers. In this manner, creating ourselves our own paper money, we control its purchasing power, and we have no interest to pay to no one." This fact was a wake-up call to the financiers of the Bank of England, as they now realized that they had an economic giant growing right under their nose that was still largely independent from their rule. The English bankers, now realizing that they've completely missed out on subduing the colonies financially, decided to act fast, and the following year issued a currency bill which restricted the ability of the colonies to issue their own paper money and banned its use to pay for debts, both public and private. The reason why the bank had such an allergic reaction to debt-free currency is because with it, the government could largely pay its own debts without incurring much of a cost, and therefore countering debt, the bankers' most precious strategy. Instead, the Bank of England was to, in return for interest paid for by the American taxpayer, issue English money in America. The money supply suddenly contracted. Unemployment rose to almost 50%. The long-term effects of this restriction imposed onto America could be called the main cause of the Revolutionary War, as the effects of this decision were more profoundly damaging to the prosperity in America than any later tax imposed onto the colonies. The war, unlike many think, wasn't some profound moment of liberation from the English, as the bankers of London still managed to get their foot in the door by establishing a bank, mostly owned by them and their agents. This would end up being their back door into power in the freshly independent US. The Bank of the US was established in 1791 under the guidance of Alexander Hamilton, who said that, and I'm not kidding, a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. The wisdom of the government will be shown in never trusting itself with the use of so seducing and dangerous an expedient as issuing its own money. He basically praised the idea of stripping the government that is held accountable by the people of the right to issue currency and delegating this duty to a group of independent and anonymous bankers. Just a year after the bank's establishment, a massive panic would spread by the bank issuing cheap loans and unexpectedly calling them in, which resulted in financial chaos. Who would have thought that a 75% foreign-owned central bank would be detrimental to the American people? This strategy that the bankers used was pretty smart. They first made sure that the US was severely in debt as a result of the Revolutionary War. They then went on to establish a supposedly independent bank that was supposed to help manage the war debt. Then they made sure that debt always remained constant by implementing debt-bearing currency to shackle the government to their money. Now, the general population disliked the first bank, and so did many politicians. Thomas Jefferson was one of them, and when the bank's charter came up for renewal in 1811, he straight up refused the extension, and when the Congress voted on the bill, the bank was closed with just one vote difference in favor of closure. The American people have managed to win by a wafer-thin margin, but the fact of how close the vote was already showed a concerning amount of power the bankers possessed. Mayer Amschel Rothschild, supposedly one of the largest investors in the bank, allegedly flew into a rage when he found out the bank was going to be collapsed. He also supposedly threatened war onto the US if they were not to listen to his demands. Whether this is true or not, England unsurprisingly declared a war on the US 1 year after the first bank was abolished, most likely acting on the behalf of the financiers. The purpose of the 1812 war was to starve the US of money and make them bend the knee before the Bank of England's financiers. This plan succeeded, and over the bones of the 24,000 that lost their lives during the war, a second bank of the US was established to pay for the national debt, which has ballooned 182%. The real winners of the war were the European financiers, as they now had a second chance at attaining control over the US, with the second bank that hung above the livelihoods of everyday Americans, like the fabled sword of Damocles, ready to cause destruction at any moment. Another step in financially taking over a country includes crashing the domestic market. A simple recession will suffice because the ultimate goal of causing a market slump is to buy up property, contracts, and resources at artificially depressed prices, which allows you to monopolize industry, land, and resources to further your own leverage over the people and government. If you remember the timeline, we've just had a fresh new bank established on US soil, and when you're a banker and you've finally gotten your foot in the door, you don't stop there. You need to be proactive in how you take over your new domains. First of all, the freshly established bank started lending money freely, particularly to prospectors, speculators, and settlers moving westwards into the frontiers, trying to make a living in the unexplored American interior. This was part of the many settling policies where any free citizen could receive a plot of land on credit in the frontier out west. This policy, going hand in hand with the Manifest Destiny ideals, made land, resources, and building and infrastructure contracts way more expensive due to extreme demand. Demand was extremely high, mainly because farming at that time, during the Napoleonic Wars, was extremely profitable in the US as European agriculture was unproductive during the wars. As a result, American grain was valued really high, and knowing that the Midwest is one of the largest pieces of arable land on the planet made it very appealing to settlers, and so many people bought land out west on credit. America found itself in the middle of a rapid economic uptrend. But it never is this easy, is it? The bankers, however, despite lending so much money, didn't make many changes to the reserve capital of the bank and were purposefully teetering on the edge of an insolvency crisis. They also knew that the Napoleonic Wars would at some point come to an end and that European agriculture would grow back again, negatively impacting grain prices in the US. But they still did nothing to remedy the situation. As a result, when the news from the market started coming in that European grain production started rebounding after the wars ended, this decreased the demand for American grain in Europe, which in turn crashed grain prices in the US. Keep in mind that many settler farmers purchased their land on credit. Then the news came that grain will not be able to cover their loans. The bank, instead of reacting accordingly to such a delicate situation, decided to all at once start calling in the loans. This meant they demanded payment of the loans instantly, at the worst, least stable possible moment when no one could ever possibly pay their loans due to a drop in grain prices. This caused many to default on their loans, and if it wasn't bad enough, the bank started increasing interest rates, so they made it even harder for people to pay their loans. The way the bank handled the grain price crash was so unbelievably bad that it only could have been deliberate. This resulted in desperate people selling their properties out west for dirt cheap just to afford to pay their debts, and in turn, land and resources in the frontier drastically fell in price. This allowed the financiers and their accomplices to buy land, acquire contracts and resources at really low, artificially depressed prices. This is how the 1819 to 21 artificially induced recession took place. It devastated entire families, made their hard work worthless, and with a bit of market manipulation paired with good timing, managed to enrich the ones working with the bank by allowing them to purchase dirt cheap land. This artificial recession was just another argument for the abolishing of the private central bank on American soil, and there was a man that would seize this opportunity to do just that. Andrew Jackson was known as a man who despised foreign influence on American soil. He is known to have refused to polish the boots of a British officer during the American Revolution, in turn being slashed over the face with a saber at just 14 years old. The fact that all his relatives also died fighting the British made him a man that despised Britishness with all his might. He would serve 2 terms as president, and during his re-election he would build up enough courage and support to stand face to face with the second bank of the US, which he knew to be a foreign and subversive institution. He said that it is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes, and that controlling our currency, receiving our public monies, and holding thousands of our citizens' independence would be more formidable and dangerous than the naval and military power of the enemy. The fact that nobody knows their stories, yet they still are some of the most influential people on this planet, is astounding. To have the ability not to possess wealth, but to create it, speaks volumes of the caliber of individual we're dealing with here. These guys, however lacking the fame and glory of Julius Caesar or Napoleon, were nonetheless the biggest conquerors of their times, and still are. But this is the catch. I can't tell you their stories as individuals because they did everything to cover up their tracks. I can't tell you more about them because they have succeeded. I can only speak of their actions. That's why sometimes when talking about them it sounds like I'm describing a hive mind instead of actual individuals. But that's not the case. This one is an absolute classic, but for the sake of not getting kicked off YouTube, everything I'm going to say here is not fact and purely hypothetical. The strategy is, of course, assassinations, the most direct way of removing any opposition through sheer force. As far as I know, no assassination has ever been ordered by wealthy individuals associated with the Bank of England, and only conspiracy theorists would claim such a thing. They're always the doings of a mentally unwell gunman who conveniently cannot be held accountable for his actions and cannot or doesn't get to stand trial. But be careful if you decide to utilize this powerful tool. If you attempt to take someone out and fail in doing so, you might just cause that person to dedicate the rest of her life to retribution. Now, let's go back slightly as I want to show you an interesting observation. Remember when England went to war against the US in 1812? The English Prime Minister at that time, Spencer Perceval, was against dragging the country into this war by the bankers and refused to declare it. He was promptly assassinated in 1812 and replaced by Lord Robert Liverpool, an avid supporter of the war. The official story tells us about the disenfranchised businessman who killed the Prime Minister as a result of mental illness and aggravation from prior failures in life, but the coincidence of Perceval refusing to go to war and the same year being assassinated is interesting to say the least. But keep in mind that this strategy either gets rid of the problem or amplifies it tenfold when it fails, and this hypothetical case study will show how potentially dangerous the strategy backfiring could be. Back to Andrew Jackson. The bankers caught wind of the vehement opposition that he was putting up. And listen, I'm not implying that they arranged anything, but the fact is that shortly after his re-election under the slogan of abolishing the bank, there would be a failed attempt on his life. It happened right as Jackson was leaving the US Capitol building. An English house painter walked up to him and pulled out a pistol that misfired, afterwards pulling out another pistol that also misfired, allowing the president to apprehend the assassin and leave unscathed. Even before the assassination, Jackson said, when talking to his friend, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me, but I will kill it." He was the first ever US president that had an attempt on his life, and he coincidentally was an enemy of the bank as well. In retaliation, Andrew Jackson made it his mission to collapse the bank by not extending its charter. He would also manage the impossible task and would repay the national debt of the US in its entirety, the only president to ever do so. The US would go on to develop for 77 years without the need for a central bank afterwards. Jackson's actions were extremely inflammatory to the European banking conglomerate, as they now were back to square one in the grand scheme to subjugate the US financially. The bankers, after this loss, would still persist in their goals and would search for an opportunity to strike and ensnare the US to their credit. From part 1, we know that the best moment for bankers to strike is during a war. War always necessitates a lot of spending, and the sheer desperation and uncertainty of its belligerents makes it easy to corrupt many of them, talk to their weaknesses, overwhelm their better judgment with a simple promise of a monetary infusion in the form of a loan to win the next battle just to stay afloat. Such circumstances unfortunately revealed themselves during the American Civil War, and the bankers were just waiting for someone to take the bait of easy money in the form of a loan to ensnare the nation once again. But first, let's set the stage. The most recognizable person from this period of the US Civil War is probably Abraham Lincoln. He is known in mainstream history for two particular things: abolishing slavery and being assassinated. When the Civil War broke out, Lincoln went to New York bankers to secure funding for his cause. This was the exact moment the financiers had been waiting for, a desperate president in need of financial help, everything they needed to force themselves back into power. The loans Lincoln was offered had rates varying from 24 to 36%, just high enough to be a genuine problem in paying off later and warrant the creation of a central bank. Lincoln knew these rates were ridiculous and returned home empty-handed, having refused the offer. He didn't really know what to do to fund his war effort, but his friend Colonel Dick Taylor came to his help by telling him to just pass a bill that will allow him to print fiat currency created out of nothing to help him save precious capital. The plan was simple and worth trying. It meant the creation of fiat money, ex nihilo, without taking on any debt in its creation, with no gold or silver standard, very similar to the fiat money that the colonial governments used to issue at one point. The new banknotes were called greenbacks and allowed Lincoln's government to have an extremely flexible fiscal policy, being able to regulate the supply of money without incurring much cost at all. Lincoln said that the great advantage of the United States over the banks is that it can issue its own money. The bankers were livid when they saw what Lincoln was doing. He created currency that couldn't be manipulated by controlling the silver or gold supply, and that as a result could be printed free of debt because you didn't have to buy metal bullion each time you printed money. It wasn't a case of merit or principle that debt-bearing currency is better than debt-free currency. It was a case of whether the bankers will get to conquer the US or not. The bankers retaliated by getting a bill through Congress to make it not possible to pay debt with Lincoln's dollars, and soon pulled all greenbacks out of circulation. Lincoln's currency being pulled out of circulation caused a deflationary spiral, which is reported to have caused failure of over 5,000 businesses and ushered in the era of the Long Depression. Lincoln allegedly said that I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in the front of me and the bankers in the rear, and of the two, the bankers are my greatest foe. When re-elected in 1864, Lincoln made it clear that he was on a warpath against the bankers, with his goal ultimately being the restitution of the debt-free greenback dollar. In 1865, just a year after his re-election, he was assassinated. The motivations of his killer are supposedly that of a disenfranchised Confederate sympathizer, but let's just take a moment to look at a few historical facts. Spencer Perceval, the English Prime Minister who refused to go to war with the US right after the first bank was collapsed, was assassinated. Andrew Jackson, having made himself clear that he wants to collapse the second bank of the US, had an attempt on his life, which he luckily survived, and himself blamed it on the bankers. And now Lincoln, who attempted to institute independent debt-free currency, was coincidentally killed just a year after his re-election. So we have two presidents and one prime minister that had attempts on their lives, both of these presidents proclaiming at some point their distrust of the bankers. Interesting, isn't it? Actually, you know what? There's one more person that might have fallen victim to this very strategy. Just might have. A person that on June 4th, 1963, issued an executive order that made the Treasury print $4 billion worth of $2 and $5 bills, free of any debt and interest. These bills were backed by silver, which in the 20th century was very controversial, and the seigniorage from their creation wasn't given to the US Federal Reserve, but straight to the government. That same person would go on to be assassinated less than half a year later in Dallas, Texas. That person was John F. Kennedy. But again, it would be foolish to imply any correlation. Currency as a concept is something really beautiful. It's a compacted form of labor, the value of which is ever-changing depending on when and how that labor was performed. The uninitiated might think that money is an abstract sum of all commerce and is itself an invisible and uncontrollable force. But as practice shows, that couldn't be further from the truth. When you control the value of money, you influence how people treat it, whether they invest it or hoard it. I've already mentioned issuing debt-bearing currency as a tool of subjugating the government, but controlling the very medium of exchange people value most is on another level, and to a banker is his utmost singular obsession. As when you achieve control over currency, you will be the master of all people, because if you succeed, you will be the person that directly affects how much people get paid, how their life's work, their labor is appraised and valued. The US, ever since the Revolutionary War, followed a bimetallic standard, meaning that it kept both silver and gold in its reserves to back its currency. It meant that each time the supply of money was to be increased or contracted, the supply of gold or silver had to be increased or contracted. This was a problem for someone seeking to attain control over the currency, as silver was really abundant in the 18th and 19th centuries due to intensive mining operations. So how do you seize control over a resource so abundant? You forbid its use, as a reserve resource. You make gold, the extremely scarce metal, the only standard that your currency is held to. This is exactly what happened in 1873 when the silver exchange was abolished, meaning that you could no longer coin silver bullion and that only the gold standard remained. The bankers now, because they owned most of the world's gold, were able to more effectively manipulate currency. What's funny is at one point they made the US purchase almost all their gold from 4 particular gold brokers in England, and if it wasn't bad enough, they made the US pay a 70% premium on each ounce of gold, stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from the American people by this ruse. If this isn't a masterclass in swindling, I don't know what is. According to a sworn affidavit of Frederick A. Luckenbach, he was told by Ernest Said, an English-German banker, that the abolishment of the silver exchange in the US was ordered by the governors of the Bank of England. This whole endeavor with the forced institution of a singular gold standard is now known as the crime of 1873, as a consequence of not only the supposed deliberation of the European bankers to attain control over American fiscal policy, but also the extremely numerous bank panics and recessions that followed afterwards. What made the crash of 1907 so interesting is that early in the year before the panic took place, Jacob Schiff, a prominent banker, coincidentally said that unless we have a central bank with adequate control of credit resources, this country is going to undergo the most severe and far-reaching money panic in history. And guess what? The exact same year, a crash ensued. Shares on the New York Stock Exchange plummeted 50%. Further down the line, an 11% drop in industrial production was noted, a 26% rise in imports, and unemployment going from 3% to 8%. This particular crash was strong enough to collapse most populist opposition to the creation of a central bank, as most media outlets in the country said that the establishment of one would be the only solution to the constant crashes. Those crashes, of course, were caused by bankers, so what the bank was to be in essence is a ransom. Ransom to stop ruining the economy every 3 years. The 1907 crash was the straw that broke the camel's back, and the US government buckled under the power of the financiers for one last time. In order to mislead the public, the conspirators created 2 seemingly different plans for the institution of a central bank on US soil. One was called the Aldrich Plan, the other one was known as the Wall Street Plan. Both plans would still lead to the creation of a central bank, with small cosmetic differences to serve as distractions. In 1910, the most influential bankers in America, including many agents working on behalf of the largest banking houses of Europe, snuck out of New York and traveled to Jekyll Island. On that luxurious hunting estate, owned by financier J.P. Morgan, the fate of the world was decided by a group of financiers known as the First Name Club, as only first names were used to communicate as not to reveal their identities. They would go on to plan the establishment of the US Federal Reserve, a central bank to rule them all, an institution that would transfer the ability to govern fiscal policy away from the US government, an institution more or less held accountable by the people, into the hands of a small banking oligarchy. The bill to create the Fed was opposed in the Senate, with President Woodrow Wilson allegedly threatening the senators with denying them their Christmas break until they passed the bill establishing the Federal Reserve. Congressman Charles A. Lindbergh Sr. commented on this bill by saying that this act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the president signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized. The worst legislative crime of the ages is perpetrated by the banking and currency bill. The Federal Reserve is not a federal institution. Its ownership is entirely private, its owners are anonymous and not held accountable at all. It genuinely sounds like a conspiracy theory, but that information is out there for everyone to see. Would it be a massive conspiracy to claim that bankers, a well-documented group of people, are realizing their best interest? That best interest being not having a target on their backs at all times? That's how you end up with a bank that doesn't disclose its ownership and tries to camouflage itself as a simple and honest federal institution. Remember when the financiers said that the establishment of the bank would bring about financial stability? Yeah, 16 years after the creation of the Fed, the single greatest market collapse would bring about the Great Depression. The creation of the Fed was the moment in which the US government was stripped of its ability to govern fiscal policy and therefore lost its independence, akin to a prince being turned into a vassal by surrendering his weapon to the king. That weapon, that fiscal policy, from now on would go on to serve the interest of the new master. When you demystify the establishment of a central bank, you realize that it's nothing more than a power transfer. But again, how many profoundly important historical events, such as the collapse of Rome, could just be reduced to being a simple power transfer?